So in this segment, we're going to be talking about this crazy article by Daniel Hannan, I like saying his name like that, I don't know why, saying we should have stayed in the single market, but rejoining now would be madness, which isn't true. This is based off an article that someone, a Tory MP called Tobias Elwood, wrote recently. I'll cover that at some point as well. Daniel Hannan says leaving the market was an upheaval, but it was a chance to deregulate. Instead, ministers are retaining rules we once fought to repeal, and this is painful for multiple reasons because Daniel Hannan exudes the faux intellectual. He's very much not very bright. He'll throw in words and terms that make him seem a lot more intelligent than he is. But it's just madness. He does acknowledge a couple of his shortcomings in a sense, but I can't even. So Hannan says, staying in the single market or large parts of it would have saved us a lot of trouble had we declared immediately after the 2016 vote that we intended to join EFTA to return to the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, the body we founded in 1960 as an alternative to the EEC. Now, I didn't know that it was an alternative to the EEC, that the UK founded EFTA, so he has taught me something. But it's quite interesting. But just because we joined EFTA wouldn't have alleviated all the problems we have. If you look at when it comes to imports, there are issues around physical checks that happen, but those happen at other borders as well. That happens between the EU border and Norway, for example, because Norway isn't in the customs union. Norway essentially has a regulatory alignment with the EU, so essentially they accept all the rules the EU makes. However, there are still checks at the Norwegian border with the EU member states there. Same thing with Switzerland as well. Switzerland has made itself into a virtual single market, but there are still customs checks there because there are customs fees involved potentially because these countries aren't in the EU's customs union. Also Turkey, there are still checks between Turkey and the EU countries on customs because Turkey isn't fully in the EU's customs union. I've said the phrase customs union a lot. So had we stayed in the single market, we would not have been at risk of an EU embargo. Now, I don't know if that's strictly true because if we had refused to do customs checks on goods going into the Irish Sea, that could have been problematic. The withdrawal issues, notably the management of the Irish border, would have been much more easily resolved, which is true that because there's regulatory alignment there's a lot less checks between, say, Norway and an EU member state compared to Great Britain with France, for example, because there's already regulatory alignment between Norway and Sweden, for example. He says, I wanted a Swiss type accommodation. Now, the Swiss type accommodation is different to the Norwegian one. There are differences, nuances. He says that no one was talking about leaving the single market. In their memory, this has become a pledge that I repeatedly made during the campaign. But the thing is, it was many Brexiteers who said that. It wasn't just you. It was Owen Paterson, the disgraced former MP. It was even Boris Johnson. So to argue that, you said no one would leave the single market, you were a prominent Brexiteer. It is a terrific gotcha because you said no one is talking about leaving the single market yet. 4 years on from there, we left. We were leaving the EU single market. The fact is that the first half of 2015, almost no one was talking about leaving the single market. Do you know why? Because you wouldn't have won. The Brexit you promised made no sense because we could not fully stop freedom of movement and stay in the EU single market because there are 4 pillars of the single market, which is free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, and free movement of people. And Brexiteers, I'm not going to say Daniel Hannan specifically, Brexiteers were very much against freedom of movement for people. So there was no way for us to just stay in the single market. It's impossible. The long-standing Eurosceptic complaint is that we wanted to join a common market, but not a common government. Again, the EU is not a common government. It gives member states a ton of leeway. It's not like you can't make it out like it's the federal government versus US states in America. It's a lot more lenient than that. It's the Commission. The Commission takes its orders from the heads of EU member states. So to argue that we didn't join. To argue that the EU have some sort of control over us doesn't make any sense because we played a fundamental part in the shaping of these laws. We were the ones who pushed for the banning of third country shellfish, and now it's come back to bite us. Not fun, is it? Once the campaign got underway, positions hardened on both sides. Yeah, because it's you're running for votes at that point. It doesn't matter what you say. You guys were happy to lie. Broadly inside many of the EU's economic structures, but outside its political structures and its customs union, that's where they wanted to be. But the thing is, outside its political structures was never going to happen because the EU is inherently very political. To stay in the EU single market, you don't get a say on EU rules. and to be outside this customs union. If you want to be outside the customs union, that comes with checks. There'll still be checks at the border. It won't be, physical inspections, etc., but it'll be customs checks, and you'll still have to pay customs duties on imports. So once again, Daniel Hannan, like, what are you talking about? On the morning of June 24th, I appeared on the BBC's One Show after David Dimbleby announced the result, saying that Brexit would be a process rather than an event, which is true. It was a process, a long one. As 2 of the 4 home nations had voted to stay in, and the overall margin had been narrow, so we would need to find an outcome that both sides could live with. And the simple fact is we didn't. Because if we look at the outcome now, Northern Ireland is still in the EU single market and customs union for goods. They're not aligned with us. Scotland are really upset because they've lost a ton of business because of Brexit. Not happy. Wales are the same. So to argue that we need to find something that would benefit everyone, there was no such outcome. There was no such outcome. Us joining EFTA, which was impossible, by the way, because the Nords had already said they're going to veto it. So us joining EFTA was a pipe dream in itself. For people who argue we'll get a bespoke deal, I've seen certain YouTubers, not going to mention names, you know who you are, saying, oh, we just got to rejoin the customs union and the single market. I'm going to state this again. One does not simply rejoin the single market and the customs union. It doesn't happen like that. You have to go through EFTA for the single market, and we're not going to get EFTA access. Let's be clear here. We can't even get access to Norwegian fishing waters. He says, I have little doubt had Cameron been succeeded by Leaver, that would have happened. I mean, definitely not, because even if right, we could have stayed in the EU single market, which could have happened under May's backstop deal. Do you think Brexiteers would have been happy being rule takers? Yes, we stopped making the rules and now we take the rules. We would have become what they said we were, a vassal state essentially, taking rules from the EU with having no input into them. That's what would have happened. They wouldn't have been happy with that because that's what they argued against. They argued against staying in, joining an EFTA-style agreement. They argued against Theresa May's deal based on the fact that we would be rule takers. That's why they did it. So to argue that a Brexiteer would have kept us in an EFTA-style agreement is ridiculous. Honestly, this is revisionist history. This is very revisionist history. Signore Gove said, spoke often during the campaign of staying in the European Free Trade Zone that had stretched from Iceland to Turkey. Boris Johnson had wrote, okay, this Gove thing makes no sense, right? Because, again, Iceland, right, situation is very different to Turkey's. There are levels to the EU. There's the customs union, there's the single market, and there's all sorts of other bilateral deals that the EU has with different states. So to argue that we want to stay in the European Free Trade Zone is such a broad statement because there are so many different aspects of it. There's some sort of chart people put up which shows you the different levels to the EU: customs union, single market, bilateral agreements, etc. If you can find that, feel free to have a look. But point being is that there are so many different levels to it. To argue that we wanted one of those, it just doesn't make sense because they're so different. Johnson wrote a Telegraph column calling for bridges to be built with Remainers. The only change, and it will not come to any great rush, is that the UK will extricate itself from the EU's extraordinary opaque system of legislation. Again, bro, it's televised. The EU Parliament is televised. It's not opaque. If the EU system is opaque, our system is opaque. Makes no sense, honestly. The vast and growing corpus of law enacted by the European Court of Justice. You do realise courts don't come up with legislation, right? Courts don't come up with legislation. They act within the law. They see what the law is. If they think you're in breach of it, they'll tell you you're in breach of it and they'll give the consequences out. Courts don't set the law. Come on, man. From which there can be no appeal. There's no appeal for the UK Supreme Court. The UK Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. There's no appeal from it. Just because there's no appeal from a court doesn't, that's why you have the highest courts. Otherwise, you have a system of consistent appeals. It won't make sense. That's why you have the top courts. That's why the US has their Supreme Court. Once it goes there, that's it. It's done until it comes back through the court system years down the line, honestly. The only difference is the US court system's insane, where they elect it's Congress. I think it's the Senate that elect Congress and the President that select judges. It's a very political system. It makes no sense. But the EU system's not like that. So again, come on, guys. Reading these articles from these people who think they're a lot smarter than they are is very painful. Perhaps Johnson, whose car had been attacked by a Europhile mob, again, don't go attacking people's property. Don't do that. His political antenna were twitching and he sensed the need for a quick compromise. Yet he got that in 2019 and now they keep crying about it. In a bizarre twist, every other leadership candidate was tripped up by the race, leaving only Theresa May. Oh, let's not forget, this was great times here. I think I was in, I can't remember if I was doing A-levels at the time or if I was in uni, but you had a picture of Michael Gove stabbing Boris Johnson. It was so great. Good times. Good times. Having voted Remain mainly to prove her credentials, she did so by digging in on the issue of freedom of movement, which was the only reason she could imagine anyone voted Leave. But to be fair, you guys kept arguing we need to control our borders, control immigration. You said no one wants to leave the single market. We want to keep trade with the EU. So the only reason people really had to vote for Brexit was control of our own laws, which we already had, and controlling our borders. That was it. You can argue the control money, the £350 million on the bus, but people who later were asked about that said they knew it was a lie, so you can't argue for that. The prospect of a speedy deal disappeared, and the country began to divide it into two increasingly bitter camps. The only reason why the prospect of a deal disappeared is because May lost her majority. That's the only reason it happened. Leavers who had spent decades arguing for an EFTA-type deal now held at many such arrangements as a Vichyite surrender, essentially using a big word. Essentially he's arguing that had we joined EFTA, we would have been a vassal state. But then, you can't argue that Brexiteers wanted to be have an EFTA type agreement and then say, oh, once it came to that, say, oh, we don't want that, that's really bad. What the hell, man? You were arguing that during the referendum. Nigel Farage family said, Norway, we can be like Norway, we can be like Switzerland. And then once the rubber hit the road, once those proposals were put in front of us, we said no. Starmer opposed that outcome no less determinedly because they wanted a second referendum and a return to full membership. The difference is Labour weren't in charge. They didn't have a majority. So it doesn't matter, does it? This is on the Tories firmly and the Brexiteers. The moderate Brexit, is dead. An opportunity lost, but they never had that opportunity in the first place because EFTA membership was never going to happen. An EFTA type deal was never going to happen because you have to remember the four pillars of the single market, and one of those is freedom of movement, which Brexiteers vehemently rallied against. The two strongest arguments for retaining single market arrangements, remember that the single market is not a single entity but a conglomerate of obligations, which is true to those four pillars really. Everything else comes underneath that. This would have eased the transition by finding a compromise, but the thing is, you guys didn't want the compromise. Brexiteers didn't want the compromise. Even if Daniel Hannan wanted an EFTA-style agreement, and if that's the hill he's willing to die on, fine. But the simple fact is, you guys didn't want an EFTA-style agreement in the end. So don't try and rewrite history. If you did, you would have voted for something like the backstop, because that was the only thing that gave us a transition period to figure out what we wanted to do next. During the withdrawal talks, Britain had paid a steep price for total regulatory freedom. To have made that payment but not to use that freedom would be senseless. So essentially what he argues is we need to do deregulation. Why? Because we paid so much for our freedom. Why would we rejoin the single market? Again, it doesn't make sense. Many of those calling for a return to the single market see it simply as a club to belabour the Prime Minister with. That's not true at all. The main reason we want to join the single market is to alleviate a lot of the border problems we're seeing in Dover and other ports around the country. Ridiculous argument. Because all of these people, all they understand is the culture war. That's all they live on. They live on Twitter. All they understand is the culture war. That's it. Because their lives have nothing outside of that. They haven't grown past university debates. Conservative MP Tobias Elwood says we should rejoin the single market to ease the cost of living crisis. Again, look, it's going to help with exports. It's going to help stop certain checks for imports. There's still going to be customs fees, which are problematic, but it will help slightly. Not a ton, though, I don't think. I think the customs fees are the biggest stinger. Yet the article in which he makes that case goes on to complain about farmers being undercut by unchecked imports. Now, it's a bit of a lame argument to make, but if had we done physical inspections of EU goods, that would have pushed our imports from the EU up dramatically, and that would have further increased the cost of living crisis, which is something Daniel Hannan acknowledges. But this isn't about the mechanics of a future deal. Rather, it's a way to biff Boris. But the thing is, have we rejoined the single market, then it helps farmers in the UK export, their farmed goods out to the EU, because at that point it's just customs issues to deal with, rather than things like physical inspections and other things. Especially once the mutual recognition of standards ends, which I think will end in about 2024. Once that ends, exports to the EU will be an absolute nightmare. It'll be way worse than it is now. He says, we couldn't ask for a better critic than Elwood. A Johnson loyalist told me on Friday. Other MPs seem as a long-winded, over-ambitious and thick, never a great combination. So what you're describing is Boris Johnson then. And remind me again, who's Prime Minister? Someone who is long-winded, Boris Johnson, and bit over-ambitious, him, thick, definitely, in both senses of the word, he's an idiot. So these arguments here don't make sense. I'm from a Johnson loyalist. Who told you this? Nadine Dorris. Most significant transitions involve upfront costs. It's not really true considering there was a transition period which the EU were willing to extend. During the campaign, I likened the EU to moving house, and this is where this man does analogies, and it just makes me even more annoyed because his analogies suck. His analogies are so bad. He goes, our new home might be more elegant and more comfortable, but the move itself was bound to be stressful. Moving house is very stressful. EFTA or something like it might have eased the stress. No, it would have definitely eased the stress, but again, we were never going to get an EFTA type deal, so it's pointless. But having now unloaded all our furniture and begun our new life, the worst of all outcomes would be to pack the removal lorry again and move to the house next to our old one. I mean, again, we would have worse terms than we had before, so that analogy makes no sense. Also, the fact that the new house sucks. It's not more elegant than the old one. It's constant problems. You've got endless blockages, essentially. Because look at Dover, it's full of deuce. You've got no toilets, portaloos or however you want to call it, and it's just causing endless problems for the ports of our country. We can't even get codfish now because that's mainly in Norwegian waters, and we can't even farm that stuff. So fish and chips is basically dead. What more do you want, pal? Your deal sucks. To put it more plainly, we opted during the exit talks for complete autonomy in every sphere. That's not true again. That's not true again, because to do trade with other countries and other entities, right, you have to adhere to their rules. So it doesn't matter how much we deregulate, we can't export to the EU. If we want to keep the EU as a trading partner, right, to export to, we have to adhere to their rules. So we can't actually have regulatory autonomy. The more we deregulate, the harder it is to trade with our biggest single trading partner. And it also dilutes Britain's image around the world, where if people want to import things from Britain, they'll know that we have high standards here. We don't have genetically modified crops, for example. We don't have chlorine chicken. So if you're a country where you have a growing middle class and you want to eat better products, for example, if you want better organic stuff, for example, you can import the stuff from the UK and you'll have a high degree of quality of goods. And the more we deregulate, the more we kind of kill off Britain's image in the world in terms of for goods. Having our own food standards, for example, means checks at the EU border, which again is not great. Look at the situation in Dover. But also allows us to sign more ambitious trade deals. Who wants to do more deals with Australia and New Zealand, for example, other side of the world, going to add to the climate disaster we already have, and also it's going to damage farmers dramatically. I think they're going to lose, I think it's like 98 million a year or some crazy numbers like that. Having our own financial services means that we lose automatic passporting in the EU, which again is not great. I think it means that it makes it harder for traders to kind of move around the EU, British ones, but also that the City of London can become more internationally competitive. Now, riddle me this, gang. The three major stock markets in the world, right, are in Tokyo, London, and New York, right? Why is that? Because it's not just because they have the biggest stock markets in the world. I think it's to do with time zones, isn't it? It's to do with when one closes, another one opens, right? Making the City of London more competitive with who? If you want to trade during certain hours for certain goods, you have to, or certain services even, you have to trade, in the UK. We're not going to be able to compete with Singapore. It's not going to happen. The more you deregulate, the more chance you have of causing financial instabilities, which makes us a less lucrative market. One of the reasons why the UK has such a big, financial sector is because of time zones, which, you don't have to compete Singapore for a time zone. It's impossible. Again, I asked the question, who do you want to compete with when the three largest stock markets, they have more protectionist rules than countries like Singapore? New York, I think New York's financial regulations are far more stringent than the UK's. It's just wild to me that they come up with these points. You want to compete with countries with little to no regulation. It's just madness. Having our own immigration rules means that we suffer labour shortages. Again, the UK at the moment, we have more vacancies right now than we do unemployment. So even if you put all of the unemployed people into jobs right now, you wouldn't solve the labour shortage, which is a huge problem. I think that's an unprecedented problem. And that life becomes more complicated for Britons on the continent who want to access welfare services. Now, that's something I'm not aware of. As long as you have residency, I think you can get access to welfare. It would be a bit weird if you were a resident of a country and needed access to welfare, but those options should still be available for people. But it also means that we can have a points-based system. Again, this points-based system is not working, is it? Where you have industry shortages, industry-wide shortages, so many different problems. The visa system, the points-based system, isn't resolving it. Just because you can get the points doesn't mean you can come here automatically. You still need a visa, etc. And people in the EU don't like that. Why would you want to work in the UK where you need a visa when you can work somewhere else in the EU visa free? The only thing you have to do is, declare yourself a resident. That's about it. So much easier than getting a visa. Which brings us to the real problem. Daniel, mate, you've written probably a good 300 words of nonsense, right? Absolute nonsense. And now you're saying we're going to get to the real problem. Like, this is not how you write an essay. If you wrote this at university, you'd be in big trouble, pal, because you've offered no sources as well. It was having chosen total freedom over short-term convenience, we've only made the most paltry and milk and water attempts to exercise that freedom. Again, they want, he wants a rampant deregulation. Our trade policy remains barely less mercantilist than the EU. So essentially, the idea that you export as much as you can and you import as less as you can. Even our talks with Australia and New Zealand were prejudiced by agrarian protectionism. Yet, if we didn't do that, our farms would go under way quicker than they already are. I mean, do you want farms to, do you want to just sell off all the farms? Maybe you do. Maybe you've got rich donor friends, you can just buy them up and turn them into flats. I don't know. We give in to fabricate scare stories about chlorinated chicken. Then he says washed chicken would be more accurate name, but there's more chlorine in a bag of salad. I mean, I don't think that's true. Also, who buys bags of salad? Unless you're a restaurant or a cheap restaurant, you don't really buy bags of salad. And the reason why, it's not just the chlorinated chicken that's the problem. The reason why they have to use chlorine, such high quantities of chlorine inside, to wash the chicken is because of their practices in the slaughterhouses. That's why. There's a reason why America has so many salmonella outbreaks compared to Europe. It's because they're lower food practices. So again, he doesn't address that because he's not going to, because he's an idiot. He's dense by design. There is some talk of deregulation in financial services, but so far only talk. 6 years after the Brexit vote, we have not lifted any of the rules whose imposition we fought at the time. Again, these rules weren't imposed on us. The UK played a key role in forming EU rules, especially around financial services. On top of that, we often gold-plated EU rules, so we went above what the EU's minimum was because the EU just sets the minimum rules. So we went above and beyond what the EU minimum rules were. And it's one of the things that made us attractive as a place to invest. We are even keeping in place the crazy bonus cap, which whacks up basic salaries and ensures people aren't, essentially compensated in relation to performance. But the reason why it's good to keep a bonus cap is so these guys aren't so incentivized to do casino capitalist bets. The ones that tanked our economy over a decade ago. Remember the 2007, 2008, 08 crash? The financial crash where we had to bail out the banks because they made a lot of bets that didn't work out in the end and they helped cause other problems. Do you remember that, pal? I'm old enough to remember, and I'm not that old, pal. Let's be real here. Again and again, ministers have shied away from choices that risk short-term criticism. This one's a fairly interesting one. After the Business Secretary Kwarteng was reminded of an essay he'd written calling for a freer labour market, he halted his department's review of EU employment regulations, almost all of which had been resisted by Britain at the time. Again, if the UK didn't want those, we could have stopped those before the Commission got their hands on it, because it's EU member states that, decide the law, not the Commission. They argue that the Commission's a bunch of civil servants and bureaucrats. You realise civil servants and bureaucrats don't make the laws. They don't propose the ideas behind the laws. They just get it written up. They just do what the elected officials tell them to do, the EU member states. We now have more restrictive labour laws than many EU countries. Again, mate, it's because the EU set the minimum. That's why. When you guys argued, we'd go above EU regulations, we already are. And now you're arguing, many EU countries have less restrictive labour laws than us. It's just madness, honestly. Just as we have a higher minimum wage and more expensive green levies, it's almost like the government can decide these things for themselves. Crazy, I know. The government having power and not being an EU vassal state whilst we're members. Crazy, Daniel. I just can't believe it. We have changed our tax system so that wealthy foreigners are no longer incentivized to spend their money here. Typically rich oligarchs who make their money through really bad means. And we are jacking up corporation tax, making Britain a less attractive place to do business. I'm against the corporation tax increase purely because the corporations that will pay business taxes typically are smaller ones, because a lot of the big ones do tax avoidance. Looking at you multinationals. Allowing the use of imperial measures through welcome in itself is hardly a substitute for creating low taxes. So you can see this whole culture war around imperial measurements. It's not cutting the mustard. Light regulation, free trade and sound money. Again, having lighter regulation means your money is less sound because you're more likely to lose it through casino capitalism. The unofficial manifesto of vote leave, which again you guys had no power to implement anyways. was a document called Change or Go, published in 2015, a million-word doorstopper of a book, which set out the concessions that Britain would need to make to stay in the EU. Now, I haven't bothered to read this because I can't be asked, but the argument that would stay in EFTA and control immigration and stop freedom of movement is ludicrous, and that's the arguments Daniel Hannan has effectively made here. Britain could have created a freer, more prosperous and more global Britain. Instead, we are pursuing semi-socialist economic policies. And Guy doesn't understand socialism at all, so of course he's going to come up with a dumb point like that. He goes, that is Boris Johnson's tragedy. Sadly, it's also becoming Britain's. I mean, again, this article is an absolute mess, isn't it, really, when you look at it? He makes so many nonsensical points, uses words he probably doesn't even understand. This is the guy who argued we should stay in the single market. Absolutely no one is threatening our place in the single market. And then he tried to argue that we could have used the EU single market as kind of a halfway house till we figure out what to do next. When, how does that make sense when you're saying absolutely no one is threatening our place in the single market? Evidently you were threatening our place, but you would have made it a slower process, us leaving the single market. I mean, it just makes me angry that these guys, they get paid a lot of money to write nonsense articles, absolute nonsense, that make no sense and get published in national newspapers. It makes me very annoyed that these sorts of propagandists can get away with this, and no one holds them accountable. No one. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Another Daniel Hannan classic. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. Just so done with this guy. No doubt next week he's going to write another article, or soon, in a few weeks' time, he's going to write another article. Just absolute nonsense. An unelected bureaucrat, essentially, this guy who argued against unelected people, who is now unelected in the House of Lords. But I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.